My heels clicked softly against the marble as I slipped into the back row of the ceremonial courtroom. No one turned when I entered, and that was fine. No one expected me to be here anyway. I settled into a seat no one had reserved, folding my hands in my lap, keeping my gaze low. Up front, my parents were impossible to miss. My father's posture was straight, his suit pressed within an inch of perfection. My mother's pearls caught the light each time she tilted her head to whisper to the woman beside her. My younger sister, Corinne, sat between them, radiant with pride as she prepared to take her oath. Every detail was arranged as if for a portrait, the golden child about to be sworn into the Massachusetts bar, the proud parents glowing in reflected success. I caught fragments of their voices. At least one of our children didn't give up, my mother murmured, her lips tight but smiling. My father raised his chin a fraction higher, as if the words themselves polished the family's image. I didn't flinch. I'd heard variations of that phrase for more than a decade, long enough that the sting had dulled into something else, an ache that never quite left, but no longer broke the skin. To them, I was the failure who had walked away from Harvard Medical School, the one who cracked under pressure, the one who couldn't keep up. That narrative had settled like dust in every corner of our family's life, repeated often enough that it became truth to everyone but me. I let them believe it. It was safer that way. Corinne straightened as the judge entered, and the room rose to its feet in unison. The judge's voice carried across the chamber, but my mind drifted, tugged backward by memories that had become all too familiar. I could see the long oak table in our dining room at home, polished so carefully that the chandelier reflected off its surface. Corinne always sat at my father's right hand, her posture immaculate, her smile timed to perfection. I sat a little further down, a shadow at the edge of the family portrait. Corinne's professor said she has the makings of a litigator already, my mother would announce, her pride swelling until it filled the room. Laughter followed, glasses clinked, and all eyes turned toward her, the promise of the Rowan name carried neatly in her hands. Then came the inevitable comparison, a pause just long enough to remind everyone of me. Of course, Celine is still finding her way. A polite chuckle, sometimes a sigh. Once, an uncle leaned across the table with a smirk and said, "Better to quit early than to waste more tuition." My father didn't correct him. He just pressed his lips into a line and refilled his wine. Even the silences carried weight. When Corinne passed her ethics exam, the family toasted with champagne. When I withdrew from Harvard, no one raised a glass. My name became shorthand for disappointment, woven into jokes too sharp to laugh at. I learned to school my face, to butter my roll without trembling fingers, to let their words pass through me as if I were glass. What they never knew, what they were never meant to know, was that the moment I stepped away from their world, another door had opened, one they couldn't imagine. The gavel struck lightly at the front of the room, pulling me back to the present. Corinne rose with confidence, ready to take her oath, while I remained in the shadows, carrying the truth that none of them had ever bothered to ask for. There was a time when my name at Harvard Medical carried weight. First-year anatomy, neurophysiology, pharmacology. I devoured them all. My professors praised my focus. My classmates whispered about my grades. I lived in the library, slept with flashcards under my pillow, convinced that if I kept my head down, I could carve a place for myself in a world where precision meant everything. It unraveled the day I opened the wrong folder. At first, I thought it was a filing mistake, a memo tucked into a research summary that had nothing to do with it. But the numbers didn't lie. A funding stream traced back to a pharmaceutical company, tied neatly to a faculty member's name, and to a grant that had guaranteed one of my classmates a prestigious clerkship. It wasn't just sloppy, it was intentional. I took it to the ethics board, certain I was doing the right thing. Within a week, my access to internal systems was revoked. A professor who once praised my surgical simulations now refused to acknowledge me in the hall. Study partners drifted away. whispering behind their hands. The girl who never faltered was suddenly the cautionary tale. When the call came, it was from an unlisted number. The woman on the other end spoke calmly, her tone professional but not unkind. She told me she worked with a division inside the Department of Justice, one that specialized in medical ethics and corruption. They had been watching my school. She said, watching certain faculty, certain deals, and someone like me observant, unwilling to look away, might have value. If I was willing to leave one world behind and step into another, I signed the withdrawal papers the next day. My parents thought I had cracked under the weight. My mother asked if I was pregnant. My father refused to speak to me for weeks. But by then, I was already filling out clearance forms, already memorizing case files, already stepping into a life that required silence. Corinne's oath echoed in the present courtroom. But my mind held another vow, the one I had made in secrecy, to serve justice in the shadows. The day I left Harvard, the story my family told about me hardened into stone. To them, I was the one who cracked under pressure, the daughter who had wasted her potential. They never asked questions after that, never wanted the details. It was easier to fold me into silence, to make me the shadow to Corinne's light. That shadow became my cover. On paper, I was a research assistant drifting between private firms, a dropout who never quite landed. In reality, my days were spent in windowless rooms with sealed files, tracing the invisible veins of money that fed corruption. I sifted through records of clinical trials padded with ghost patients, hospital boards approving experimental drugs in exchange for quiet donations, doctors receiving kickbacks for prescriptions that harmed more than they healed. It wasn't glamorous. Some nights blurred into dawn under fluorescent lights, my eyes raw from hours of reading ledgers. Other days I walked into hospitals under an assumed name, clipboard in hand, smiling like any junior analyst while cataloging violations that could collapse entire systems. Every file I touched had real lives buried inside patients whose trust had been betrayed, whose suffering had been monetized. That weight never left me. But the job demanded stillness. No recognition, no applause, no trace of my name. If I was successful, the public never knew. Cases closed quietly, indictments sealed, whistleblowers protected by signatures no one would connect to me. I wore anonymity like armor, because exposure meant risk. Not just to me, but to the work itself. At Christmas dinners, when relatives asked what I was doing, my father would say, "She's in research now. Nothing to do with law." They nodded, half listening, before turning back to Corinne's latest achievements. I smiled, offered polite answers, and let them look past me. It was safer that way. Years passed in this rhythm. My family's disappointment calcified, but so did my resolve. Silence became both shield and weapon, a way to exist in their world while living fully in another. And so, on the day of Corinne's swearing in, I slipped into the back row unseen, carrying 12 years of secrets in plain sight, until the judge stepped to the podium and met my eyes. The room shifted when Judge Harold Stone stepped forward. His presence carried the same weight it always had: broad shoulders, a voice built for authority, a polished smile that had charmed neighbors and politicians alike. To my family, he was a friend of decades, a man who had dined at our table and raised his glass at holiday toasts. To me, he was the central figure in an ongoing investigation, his name traced across offshore accounts and illicit donations hidden behind shell companies. I sat perfectly still as he adjusted his papers, beginning his remarks with the kind of ease born from habit. He congratulated the candidates, reminded them of the sacred duty of ethics, wove words together with the confidence of a man who believed his image unshakable. My parents watched with pride, my father leaning forward as if these were words he himself could have written. But then Stone's gaze lifted, sweeping across the rows until it landed on me. For a moment, his practiced rhythm faltered. Recognition sparked, quick and sharp, followed by something else: awareness, perhaps even guilt. I held his stare, just long enough to acknowledge what we both knew, before lowering my eyes. The silence stretched longer than it should have. Then, unexpectedly, he cleared his throat and set the papers aside. "Before we proceed," he said, his voice resonant but edged with strain, "I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge someone present today, someone whose integrity reshaped my view of law, though not in the way she may have intended." A ripple of confusion spread through the courtroom. Stone's gaze settled firmly on me. "Thank you, Dr. Celine Rowan." The words struck like a gavel. The air changed instantly. Heads turned, necks craned, whispers erupted, then died in the weight of silence. I saw my father's hand tighten around the arm of his chair until it trembled. My mother's breath hitched audibly, her posture frozen. Corinne stiffened beside them, her confidence cracking into disbelief. I did not move. Years of training kept my face calm, my breathing even, but inside, every instinct sharpened. I had come prepared for many outcomes, but not for this being seen in a room where I had been invisible all my life. Stone lifted his papers again, resuming the speech as though nothing had happened, but the courtroom would not forget, and neither would my family. When the ceremony ended and the applause began, I knew the reckoning I had avoided for years would come before the day was done. The reception hall hummed with the usual polite chatter and clinking of glasses, but beneath it ran a different current. Conversations faltered as people glanced my way, then looked quickly back as though they hadn't. I stood near the edge of the room, a glass of ginger ale untouched in my hand, watching trays of hors d'oeuvres circle past. It didn't take long. My father's voice cut through the crowd, low but commanding. "DOJ." Since when his eyes pinned me from across the room, sharp and searching, the same look he used to level at witnesses on the stand. I didn't flinch. Since Harvard, I answered evenly. I was recruited during the ethics investigation. I didn't drop out. I was asked to leave one world to serve in another. For a moment, there was only stillness. My mother's hand shook as she adjusted her bracelet. Her lips parted, but no words coming. She looked as though the ground beneath her had tilted. Corinne stepped forward, her expression tight, her voice edged with something between curiosity and disbelief. "That DA case last year, the one with the sealed indictments, was that your team?" I let the question hang before replying. "The prosecutor flagged in that case was on our radar 2 years earlier. Let's just say you weren't arguing alone." Her eyes widened, the certainty in her face flickering into something more complicated. My father exhaled, a slow, measured breath that sounded like it belonged in a courtroom. He was recalculating everything he thought he knew, every word he had ever spoken about me in disappointment. My mother finally spoke, her voice softer than I'd ever heard it. "We thought you were lost." "I wasn't," I said gently. "I was doing exactly what I was trained to do. You just weren't allowed to know. No one applauded. No one cried. But for the first time in years, no one looked past me either." The silence was heavier. Yes, but it was the kind that acknowledged presence, not absence. And as the evening thinned, I knew the reckoning wasn't finished. It would follow me home. The house felt smaller than I remembered. The walls, once looming and untouchable, seemed worn at the edges. The colors faded. My mother disappeared upstairs without a word, her footsteps careful on the carpet. My father remained near the fireplace, hands clasped behind his back, his gaze heavy but unreadable. When my mother returned, she carried a cardboard box, its edges taped and yellowed with time. She set it gently on the coffee table, smoothing her palm across the lid before peeling it open. "I kept these," she said quietly. "I don't know why. I just couldn't throw them away." Inside lay pieces of a life I had been forced to abandon, my Harvard ID badge, bent at the corners, a folder of commendations I never showed them, notes from professors about clerkships that never came to pass. Beneath the stack was a thin envelope, still sealed. She handed it to me with trembling fingers. This came last year. No return address. We didn't know what it meant. I slid the paper free. A certificate from the Department of Justice, intentionally vague, recognizing service in matters of national integrity and judicial security, nothing explicit, nothing traceable, but real nonetheless. My father stepped closer, his eyes fixed on the page as though it were a declassified file. His jaw tightened, then slowly eased. "You protected people like me," he said finally, his voice lower than I'd ever heard it. "And I failed you." He extended his hand, not the gesture of a father reclaiming authority, but of a man offering respect. For a moment, I hesitated, then placed my hand in his. The grip was steady, and it carried weight I had waited years to feel. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't redemption. But it was the first crack in the wall between us, and I knew more would follow. Weeks later, I walked through the side gate of my parents' backyard without hesitation. Folding chairs lined the lawn, neighbors balancing paper plates on their laps, children chasing each other near the fence. The smell of charcoal and lighter fluid hung in the air, the same as every gathering before, but this time I didn't linger in the driveway or wait for someone to notice me. I carried a dish of berry crumble and placed it on the table as though I had always belonged. My father spotted me first. He straightened from the grill, not stiff with formality, but tall with pride. "Everyone," he said, drawing the attention of his circle of colleagues and old friends. "This is my daughter, Dr. Rowan, Department of Justice." There was no hesitation in his voice, no careful pause to soften the introduction. Just fact. A few heads nodded respectfully, and the weight of it settled quietly into the air. I hadn't expected applause, and none came, but the absence of dismissal felt like a kind of ceremony all its own. Later, near the cooler, Corinne found me. She carried 2 plates stacked high and offered me one with a crooked smile. For a moment, she studied me, her expression caught between pride and something sharper. "All this time," she said, "I thought I was carrying the family's name. Turns out you were carrying the weight none of us could see." Her tone wasn't bitter, but it wasn't free of envy either. I met her eyes and held them, letting silence answer what words couldn't. She laughed softly, shaking her head, and handed me the plate. The sky darkened into shades of rose as sparklers flickered in the hands of children. For the first time in years, I wasn't outside the circle watching. I was in it, on my own terms, and the night felt different because of it. In the quiet after the gathering, I sat alone on the back porch, the sound of laughter fading into the hum of cicadas. For years, my silence had been mistaken for surrender, my absence written as proof of failure. I let them believe it because the truth was too heavy to explain, and because the work demanded shadows, not spotlights. Now, with my father's words still echoing, "This is my daughter, Dr. Rowan. D.O.J." I understood how easily a single sentence could rewrite years of judgment. Yet, as warming as that recognition felt, I realized I hadn't been waiting for it. My worth had never depended on their applause. It had been measured in the whistleblowers I protected, the patients shielded from fraud, the cases closed without fanfare. Recognition from family was new, fragile, and welcome. But it wasn't the foundation of my life. The true foundation was built in sealed courtrooms, encrypted files, late nights chasing trails that no one would ever connect to my name. That was where justice lived, not in their approval, but in the quiet victories that never touched the headlines. I thought back to the girl I once was, bent over her medical textbooks, believing success was defined by titles and degrees. She would never have imagined that the greatest measure of her life would be invisible to those she loved most. But perhaps invisibility had been its own kind of shield, until now, as the last sparkler fizzled out in the yard. I stood, ready to step back into a life where the applause didn't matter. Only the work did, and I knew the story wasn't finished. Not for me, not for them. I thought back to that first moment in the courtroom, sitting alone in the back row while my family whispered about failure. For so long, I had let their story define me, the daughter who quit, the one who couldn't keep up. I carried that silence like a burden, but it had been my shield, too. Now I understood what those years had really meant. Silence wasn't surrender. It was discipline. It was the space that allowed me to do the work no one else could see. It was the cost of protecting what mattered. When Judge Stone spoke my name, the narrative they had clung to cracked apart for the first time. They saw me not as the girl who disappeared, but as the woman who had chosen to walk a different road. That recognition mattered, but not in the way I once imagined. What mattered was knowing that even in silence, I had never abandoned myself. Dignity doesn't always shout. Sometimes it sits quietly at the edge of a room, waiting for truth to arrive. Sometimes it looks like weakness until the moment it stands and cannot be ignored. I no longer needed to prove my worth to them, or to anyone. The life I built in shadows was enough, and time had spoken for me, because in the end, truth doesn't whisper. It waits, it endures, and when the moment comes, it speaks so clearly no one can look away.